Jill Brown, and I am Director of Public Programs at Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust. Thank you so much for joining us for today's program. Good afternoon. My name is Jill Brown, and I am Director of Public Programs at Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust. Thank you for joining us for today's program. Today, we are pleased to have with us Tom Teicholz. Tom is a longtime friend of our museum. Every summer, he curates a Holocaust Remembrance film series at the museum. He's also an award-winning journalist and author. And today, we will be discussing his most recent book, Ivan of the Extermination Camp: How the Trials and Denials of Nazi Collaborator John Demjanjuk Added to Our Understanding of the Holocaust. Tom covered Demjanjuk's trial in Jerusalem in 1987. And if you watched the Netflix series, The Devil Next Door, you may recognize Tom because he was featured extensively in that program. Also with us today is Jonathan Kirsch. Jonathan is an author and publishing attorney. He is also book editor of the Jewish Journal, and it was his review of Tom's book that prompted us to ask Tom to do a book talk at the museum. That event was scheduled to take place at the museum this evening. And after the museum was forced to close temporarily, Tom and Jonathan were gracious enough to agree to this online virtual discussion. This technology is relatively new to us, so I ask your patience in advance if we encounter any technical difficulties. If for any reason we do lose our connection, please stay where you are and we'll be back as soon as we can. After Tom speaks, Jonathan will moderate a question and answer session. If you have a question at any point during this program, please type it as a comment on Facebook and we'll answer many of those questions at the end of the program. And now I will hand the virtual microphone to Tom. One minute.
Oh.
Okay.
Thanks, Jill, and thanks all of you who are watching. I know this is a difficult time, and that spending the next half hour or hour talking about crimes of the past, of the Holocaust, may seem not relevant, but I think there is value both in knowing that as a people, we've been through terrible things and come out the other end, and that over the long arc of time, justice prevails. I'm particularly pleased to be joined by Jonathan Kirsch, who was my colleague at the Jewish Journal, who's a great author himself of works such as Harlot by the Side of the Road, and his most recent work about Herschel Greenspan. And I couldn't be more delighted to be in conversation with someone as intelligent and erudite as Jonathan.
Well, thank you, Tom. And it's a real pleasure to be in conversation with you about a very compelling book and a very compelling topic. In my review of your book for the Jewish Journal, I noted as an aside that not only are you prominently featured in the Netflix documentary that has called attention back to the Demjanjuk case, but that you were, as I put it, far and away the most astute and lucid of the voices we hear. And so I'm privileged to hear your voice again in this setting.
Thank you.
Let me start, and I suspect many of the people listening to us now will know the shape of the story already, but let me ask a very basic question to orient our conversation. Who was Ivan the Terrible? Who was John Demjanjuk? And I guess the bottom line is, are you now convinced that they were not one and the same person?
Well, I wish I could give you a short answer to those questions, and I will give the shortest answer I can, which is that the survivors of Treblinka recalled with particular horror a sadist at the camp, a guard who worked there, who was not a German, who was part of what they called the Ukrainian auxiliaries, and who stood at the entrance of the gas chamber and tortured sadistically those who were already on their way to death. And that this particular guard knew no bounds in his sadism, and also had a technical knowledge of the diesel gas engine that powered the gas chamber. And he was the one who would turn on the engine and turn it off. And he appears in the recollections of not only the survivors, the few survivors of Treblinka, but also some of the Nazis themselves who came to trial in Germany in the 60s and early 70s. John Demjanjuk was a Cleveland auto worker who in the mid-70s was alleged to have been a death camp guard at the Sobibor death camp. And when his picture was sent around to the Israel police and they interviewed Holocaust survivors, a number of Holocaust survivors, about a dozen or so, identified him as having been at Treblinka and as being the person they called Ivan Grozny, or Ivan the Terrible. Demjanjuk was tried in Israel. He was convicted by the district court, and then on appeal, he was that opinion was turned over, and I can detail why. He was returned to the U.S., where he was retried, specifically on the Sobibor charges, and then sent to Germany, where they tried him on the Sobibor charges, and for which he was convicted of the accessory to the murder of 29,000 innocent civilian Jewish men, women, and children at Sobibor. And as to whether he was at Treblinka or not, there remains doubt about that, in part because testimonies from the Soviet Union that were uncovered after the fall of the Soviet Union indicate that another person, Ivan Marchenko, was the operator of the gas chamber. However, I still believe that the identifications by the survivors remain credible. And several of the judges in Israel, and certainly the survivors, feel that Demjanjuk was at Treblinka. And again, I can go into this in more detail, but that's sort of the broad strokes.
Let me also go into tight focus on a fact about John Demjanjuk that I think reminds us of an important lesson and an often overlooked fact of the Holocaust. I think we are accustomed to thinking of the Holocaust as a crime against the Jews by the Germans. Some people would say by the Nazis, a subset of Germans. But the fact is that Demjanjuk was not German. And I would invite you to explain, where did he come from? How did he come to be at Sobibor? And what is meant by the term Travniki man, which is an ominous term?
Yes. So John Demjanjuk was born in a part of what is now the Ukraine called Dubmacharenzi, where he, with his family, survived the famine. And I'll get to this card in a second that you see, where he survived the famine. He was a trained tractor driver. When World War II began, he was drafted. He served by the by the Soviet army. He served in the Red Army, where he was at one point injured and had a scar on his back. He then rejoined the battle, and he was captured by the Germans at the Battle of Kirsch. He was then put in a German POW camp. The conditions in those camps were inhumane. They were starvation, there was typhoid, they were horrible conditions. And at those camps, the Germans came and recruited from among the Soviet prisoners, recruited them, volunteers, to serve the German army, to serve the Nazis. Those auxiliaries, also called Hiwis, also called the Ukrainians, were then taken to a training camp in the Lublin district in Poland called Travniki. At Travniki, they were given identification cards. That is Demjanjuk's Travniki ID. They were trained in weapons. They were trained in rounding up and murdering Jews. They were sent on training missions in the surrounding areas to do so. And then they were trained to serve at the death camps. Now, again, when I say death camps, we think of concentration camps, of which there were thousands. But there were 3 camps in particular, Sobibor, Treblinka, and Belzec, that were set up purely as factories of death, extermination camps. They served no other labor process helping the German war effort. Their only job was to murder innocent Jewish men, women, and children who were brought there. At Treblinka, in little over a year, in 13 months, from July 1942 to August 1943, some 870,000 Jewish men, women, and children were murdered there. At Sobibor, in a similar 10 to 12 months, 250,000 to 350,000 men, Jewish women were murdered there. Sometimes at Treblinka, as many as 15,000 in a day. Most of them within 2 hours of arrival, after they'd been made to give up all their possessions, be stripped, have their hair shorn off. They were then rushed into the gas chamber. After their dead bodies were taken out, Jewish forced laborers were forced to search their mouths for gold fillings and remove them. And then their bodies were thrown into pits or incinerated on the spot. And that's what happened at those camps. And those are the kind of places where there were 20 to 30 Germans in command and 100 to 120 auxiliaries doing what the Germans called the dirty work.
And the point being that I think you would agree that it's not accurate to say that the Holocaust was a crime conducted by the Germans. It was conducted by the Germans and their willing collaborators.
Yes, and all the people at every chain in the link who were in many ways party to what went on. But in the case of these extermination camps and the concentration camps, you have a situation where all the helpers were party to the murders. They played an active role. These guards, like Demjanjuk, were given leave. They were paid a salary. They were allowed to go take time off and go get drunk in the local villages. And they participated at every phase of the murders, the arrivals, the robbing of the possessions, and the overseeing the murders and the incineration of the bodies. So there are no innocents in these murders.
You write in your book that the identity card, which we've now seen on the screen, served as the Rosetta Stone, as you put it, of Demjanjuk's history and what was to be gleaned from his Nazi service. In addition to what you've already shared with us, what was gleaned from that document?
Well, look, I mean, if you take the big picture, you know, in 1943, there was a revolt at the Treblinka camp. Of the several hundred Jewish inmates who escaped that day, only about 50 survived. The Germans in 1943 then demolished the camp, had it plowed over. From the bricks of the gas chamber, they built a farmhouse. They put a farmer there and seeded the fields with grass so that if anybody came by, they wouldn't know what happened there. And so, you know, over time, at first, the survivors couldn't or didn't feel like sharing what they'd been through, and weren't sure anyone would believe them or even care. And so it took many years for us to learn about these camps. And when this Travniki training card was first found to exist in the mid-1970s, at the time, at first, it was a one of a kind. Demjanjuk's defense said it was a KGB forgery. No one had seen one before. But over time, we've now discovered hundreds of these. And they tell us exactly the way in which these Soviet soldiers who were drafted to serve the Nazis were trained, were given supplies, and were dispatched to various camps. And so we throughout the Demjanjuk trials from the 1970s to 2011, each time we learn more and more about how the Holocaust was perpetrated. So this one piece of information, this 4x6 cardboard document, was the start of our learning so much more.
Associated with the likely candidate for the man who was called Ivan the Terrible, that the name Marchenko appears if on that Travniki card for John Demjanjuk. Is that correct?
No. The Travniki card identifies an Ivan Demjanjuk, whose father's name is Nikolai, which Demjanjuk's name is, with his correct birth date, and with certain identifying scars that identify Demjanjuk accurately. When Demjanjuk sought to come to the United States after the war, he had to fill out numerous applications, an IRO, International Refugee Organization papers, and then his applications for a visa to come to the United States, and then eventually his citizenship papers when he applied to be a citizen. In those papers, it asked, what did you do during the war years? And Demjanjuk, on one of them, tellingly said that he spent the war years as a farmer in a town in Poland called Sobibor. Now, at later date, Demjanjuk would say he picked that name out of the air, or someone told him to write it down, or he'd never heard of it before, or he meant to write something else. But I think we can all agree that sometimes mistakes reveal as much as saying the truth. And the truth was that he was at Sobibor, just that he wasn't a farmer there. On one of those documents, he was asked to put his mother's maiden name. And he wrote Marchenko. Now, it turns out that his mother's maiden name isn't Marchenko. It's Demjanjuk. Now, why would he choose to give the wrong name? Again, his family said that Marchenko is a name in the Ukraine as common as Smith. And he just put that down. But it's not even within the top 10 most popular names. And at first people thought he put it down because he was Ivan Marchenko. That was perhaps a pseudonym he used at Treblinka. Again, when all these testimonies came out in the 1990s of people who were no longer living and we couldn't interview now and find out whether what they said was made under duress or they were told to say, nonetheless, taken as a group, they found an ID card, a Travniki card of Ivan Marchenko. Now, that Ivan Marchenko was very different than Ivan Demjanjuk. He was, first of all, 9 years older. He was substantially taller. He had brown hair, whereas Demjanjuk was, even at 21, 22, already balding. And he had a scar possibly on the side of his face. So the question is, why would Demjanjuk write Marchenko? And for many years, I didn't have a theory. I couldn't come up with an answer. And then one day it struck me that if the Germans knew that Ivan Marchenko was dead, which it turns out in the testimonies of some of the Germans at their trials in Germany in the 1960s, they said that Ivan Marchenko was murdered after he left Treblinka in fighting with Yugoslav partisans. Then maybe Demjanjuk knew he was dead too, and giving the name of a dead man's mother was perhaps safer than giving your own.
Fascinating. I want to pass along one of the questions that's been submitted by a participant or viewer of this conversation. How did it happen that someone with Demjanjuk's past could enter the United States immediately after the war and live an ordinary life for as long as he did? And the follow-up to that question is, how did he get found out in the first place? When did he come to the attention of authorities?
So as Alan Ryan Jr., the one-time head of the Justice Department's Nazi hunting unit, once said, many of the former Nazis came to the United States through the front door. They just lied on their papers, no one checked them, and they got in very easily. Keep in mind that by 1949 or so, the US was more interested in fighting communism than they were in continuing to fight Nazis. And many of these former Soviet citizens were decidedly anti-communist. Having lived under communism, they wanted no more of it. And so the US government brought them in willingly. There were 3 displaced persons commissioners, one of whom was a guy named Ed O'Connor, who was very favorably disposed to what he called the captive nations, which were the former Soviet citizens. And Ed O'Connor bent over backwards to help these people come to the States. One of the other commissioners Harold, I believe it's Rosenberg, was very skeptical. And what he said to me, I interviewed him when he was 91. He said, Ed O'Connor felt that these people had gotten a bum rap. I felt they were bums. Either way, many of them came in by lying on their papers, as Demjanjuk did. If the truth of their Nazi service had been known, they could not have become American citizens. They could not have entered the country. But all they had to do to get in was to lie, and not necessarily that convincingly, as was Demjanjuk's case. Now, in the mid-70s, a journalist for a Ukrainian-American newspaper named Michael Hanuziak, who was pro-communist, pro-Soviet, was given a grant by a Ukrainian-American organization to come visit the Ukraine, his homeland, and to meet there with journalists and judges and officials and lawyers. Now, it's very possible that Hanuziak was a communist supporter, and that the people he met with in then Ukraine, which was then part of the Soviet Union, were in one way or another either officials or had some connection with the KGB. In any event, he returned to the US with a list of some 50 to 60 names that he'd been provided with that were alleged Nazi collaborators living in peace in the US, who he set about exposing. He then took that list and wrote letters to both Senator Jacob Javits of New York and Senator Abe Ribicoff of Connecticut, giving them the information of all these Nazis who were living in the US. And again, this is something where I confirmed in the National Archives the receipt of this information and Javits' response. And Javits passed along that list to the Justice Department, who began to investigate the names on the list. And on that list were two names in particular of interest to all of us in this conversation. One was Fedor Fedorenko, who was accused of being a former high-ranking guard at Treblinka, and Demjanjuk, who was accused of having been a guard at Sobibor. And so the US Justice Department began to look into these people. Again, they realized quickly that there were many more, or there were a great number of Holocaust survivors living in Israel. And so they sent the information and the accusations and the American visa photos of those accused to the Israel police. And they in turn called in survivors to look at a photo spread. And I believe we may have one of those. Yes, Jill will put it up. That's a photo spread of Demjanjuk through the years. This is not what was shown to the witnesses, but included in this is Demjanjuk's 1951 and his 1948 visa photos. And so when the Israel police investigator called in some of the survivors, she called them in to identify Fedorenko. She knew some Treblinka survivors. And when they looked at the photo spreads, they identified Fedorenko, but the first one was in great shock. And he said, pointed to the picture of Demjanjuk, and he said, "That's Ivan of Treblinka." And she corrected him. She said, "No, our information says he's at Sobibor." And the guy said, "I don't care what your information says. That face haunts me in my dreams every night. I know that to be Ivan of Treblinka, without a shadow of a doubt. And when the second and third survivor both identified Fedorenko as being at Treblinka and identified Demjanjuk as being at Treblinka, the case took on a completely different direction. And so beginning in the 1970s, Demjanjuk began to be actively accused and prosecuted.
We know from history that the only reason Eichmann ended up in an Israeli courtroom was that Mossad went and got him. How did Demjanjuk, who was denied citizenship or had his citizenship revoked in the United States, how did he end up in an Israeli courtroom?
Well, so after Demjanjuk was his citizenship, in the United States, we can't prosecute someone for Nazi war crimes. Those are crimes that were not committed on our soil and crimes committed in the past. So all we can do in the U.S. is say that this person lied to get into the U.S. And if the truth of what they'd been doing had been known, they would have never been given U.S. citizenship. So we strip away their U.S. citizenship in a denaturalization trial, and then we order them deported, kicked out of the country. But at that point, there has to be a country willing to accept them. And at the time Demjanjuk was denaturalized and then ordered deported, everyone pretty much thought that he would probably end up back in the Soviet Union. And that's what happened to Fedorenko, who was returned to the Soviet Union, had a 10-day trial there, and was then shot for having been a guard at Treblinka. In 1985, in the midst of this, the Justice Department had a meeting with the Israeli officials, both some of the prosecutors and some people in the Israeli Foreign Ministry, and they discussed whether Israel would be willing or interested in accepting extradition, accepting deportation, or wanted to extradite U.S. citizens who were found to have been Nazi war criminals. And at that meeting, they discussed what would be an appropriate case. And the Israelis said, well, it would have to be a case where there were direct murders of Jewish people, and not just someone who was indirectly involved. And they wanted it to be a case where if they didn't do something about it, they would feel a wrong had been committed, basically, that they had to address this. And in Demjanjuk, who at that moment was believed to be Ivan the Terrible of Treblinka, the sadistic mass murderer of hundreds of thousands, it seemed like the right case. It is hard to say whether, if Demjanjuk was only known to be the murderer of 30,000 people, as terrible a crime as that is, whether they would have been as enthusiastic about accepting extradition and prosecuting him. I certainly hope they would have.
Please explain what happened to Demjanjuk when he sat in the defendant's box in the trial court in Israel, and what happened on appeal.
So at the trial in Jerusalem, which you see him in the witness box there, I'm just counting out loud, but several Holocaust survivors who were Treblinka survivors, including Pinchas Epstein, who you see there, testified and identified Demjanjuk as someone they knew at Treblinka. In addition to that, there was the Travnicki card, which was documentary evidence that Demjanjuk had been trained to serve at death camps and trained to work there. And there was his own alibi of where he was during the war years, which was found to be completely a mass of lies and not credible in the least. And over the course of the years when Demjanjuk had been held in jail, for the year prior to the trial starting, he had made a number of what were taken to be incriminating statements, like, Eichmann was big, I'm small, why are you bothering with me? Or when they spoke of certain towns that were between Sobibor and Treblinka, Demjanjuk said, why are you bringing those up? Stop, you're pushing me towards Treblinka. And they said, we didn't mention Treblinka. How do you know those are near Treblinka? And things like that. When all put together, made a very convincing beyond a reasonable doubt case that Demjanjuk was the gas chamber operator at Treblinka. Over the course of his many years of appeal, which were halted for a number of reasons, and then started up again, the Soviet Union, both at one point, in 91 was sort of in chaos, and then eventually the Soviet Union ended, and the archives became much more open. And Israeli prosecutors traveled to Moscow and were given tremendous access in the archives. And they discovered all these testimonies from the Soviet Union where they'd been conducting Nazi war crimes trials since even beginning in 1943 and 44 and 45 and 48 and into the 50s and 60s. They'd conducted many, many trials of former Soviet citizens who had assisted the Nazis, whom they called Hitlerites. And in those testimonies, there were all this information about an Ivan Marchenko being the gas chamber operator. And so on appeal, the Israel Supreme Court said that even though the identifications by the survivors were completely convincing, and there was nothing in the record to challenge their identification of Demjanjuk as having been at Treblinka, on the specific point, and even though all these declarations had very little legal value, because those people were either not alive anymore, and there had been no ability to cross-examine them, or no ability to know under what conditions they'd given their statements. Despite those statements having little legal or probative value, nonetheless, the court said it creates a shadow of a doubt. And with a shadow of a doubt, not only are we not going to sentence someone to death, we feel that Demjanjuk, having spent almost 8 years in solitary confinement in Israel, we're going to stop this proceeding now and have him deported from Israel. And the court said, the story of Demjanjuk is not over, but it's over as far as Israel is concerned.
Now, he was sent back to the United States. His citizenship was restored. Then it was revoked again, and he ends up in
the U.S. Justice Department, the courts in the U.S. said, listen, based on what's on all this new information, we're restoring his citizenship. However, if the Justice Department wants to start the process all over again and try to take away his citizenship based on the Travnicki card and on the evidence, not that he was a Treblinka, but that he was a Nazi camp guard and that he lied on those documents, they are free to go ahead. Now, many people thought that A, the Justice Department would not bother, or B, that Demjanjuk, it would take so long that Demjanjuk would live out his natural life, a free man with his family and his community in Cleveland. But to the everlasting credit of the U.S. Justice Department, regardless of whether it was a Democratic or a Republican administration, because it was both during the times in question, they in fact did prosecute Demjanjuk again. And when those German archives, when those Soviet archives opened, they found all kinds of new information that was damning as to Demjanjuk having been not only at Sobibor, but at another camp called Flossenburg, where during the time Demjanjuk was now documents showed he was there, some 10,000 Jews were murdered. And he was also at the Majdanek camp. There were now documents to show that. And the details of his service at Treblinka, when he was there, when he was posted to another camp, were all confirmed by more documentary evidence. So basically, the U.S. had what was essentially an open and shut case to have him denaturalized and deported. Now, at that point, again, there was the question of who was going to take him. Russia wasn't interested. Poland, the place where under German occupation the crimes took place, wasn't interested. Ukraine was now an independent country, and they didn't seem so interested in prosecuting Nazi war crimes. So that didn't seem to be it seemed possible that he would go to the Ukraine and live out his natural life there as a free person. So that wasn't a great choice. Germany, at first, didn't seem so interested because for the last 30 or 40 years, Germany had prosecuted German citizens who had been Nazi war criminals, but they had not prosecuted anyone who was, or very few people who were not German citizens. And beyond that, usually they wouldn't prosecute someone who was only shown to be part of the machinery of death and who there were no witnesses saying we saw him commit these murders, which is Sobibor, which had even fewer survivors than Treblinka, and almost no survivors of the death camp area who would have seen someone operating the death camp engines there. It seemed the German law was not likely to follow up on that. However, a retired German prosecutor took it upon himself to make a case to the German legal authorities that the law should not be construed that way. And with Eli Rosenbaum at the Justice Department made this argument to the German prosecutors. He said, if I and a friend of mine go to your office, and I go in the office with the purpose to kill you, and I tell my colleague to stand outside the door and under no circumstances allow you to escape because I'm going to commit murder in there. And then while I'm in that room, I, in fact, pull out a knife and murder the person inside. Under American law, because that person couldn't escape, and because the person outside was preventing his escape, the person outside is as guilty of murder as the person who wielded the knife. And Eli Rosenbaum said, that's the law in our country, and I can't believe that's not the law in Germany. And the German courts agreed. And so they began to consider that, yes, they could prosecute Demjanjuk for his crimes at Sobibor. And now here's where I'm going to give myself credit that I may or may not deserve. But in this period, when Germany was not taking Demjanjuk, I wrote an op-ed piece in the LA Times that called upon Germany to take Demjanjuk and try him, saying that they had, if not a legal obligation, certainly a moral obligation to do so. 5 days later, Germany announced that they were taking Demjanjuk. Now, I imagine that it was much in the works before then, but my timing was particularly good for that. So Demjanjuk, and because, again, there was a new, younger generation of prosecutors who were much more savvy at computer files and organization, and so much had been digitized, they were able to compile very precise records of during the time Demjanjuk was at Sobibor, from March 26, 1943, up until October 1944, that 43 or 44, I can't remember off the top of my head, that 29,000 Jews, primarily from Holland, were murdered then.
One of the striking things in the Netflix documentary was the depiction of Demjanjuk's family, his American family, and how resolute they were that their father, husband, was innocent. Was that family ever reconciled to the truth about Demjanjuk in light of the evidence that you've now described?
You know, I interviewed them, obviously, and spoke with them, but didn't have great, interactions with them. Look, I don't think there's a question that he was a good husband and a good father and a good community member. And I think, he loved his children and his children loved him. And I think that for as long as they could not believe it to be true, they didn't believe it to be true. And I think that, they made their peace with their father's denials and insistence on denials. Now, towards the end of the German trial, his son and his defense attorney in Germany started to say things like, if someone was doing what they had to do to survive, the terrible conditions in the German prisoner of war camps, and because of that were forced to do things, then then they're not, they're the same as the Jewish prisoners who had to work in the death camp, and there should be no guilt attached to them, or things like that, which are, deeply, deeply offensive. And in the German trial, the German prosecutors went out of their way to show that actually being a guard at a death camp was a paid position from which people who were disgusted or offended by what they were doing there actually could run away without being shot or murdered themselves, be reassigned, and that they often were given leave and chose to come back on more than one occasion.
Before I bring this conversation to an end, I want to congratulate you on your book, of an important and very compelling book. And I'm going to invite you as my last question to give us your impression of what Ivan Demjanjuk symbolizes about the Holocaust. And by that I mean, when we think of Eichmann, in Hannah Arendt's memorable phrase, we think of the banality of evil, a bureaucrat, a man who sat at a desk and made sure that the trains to Auschwitz ran on time. What does Demjanjuk symbolize in the larger story of the Holocaust?
Well, first, Jonathan, first of all, I want to thank you again for doing this. And I want to say to all the people who are listening, thank you so much for your support, for doing this. You know, at this time, I urge you not for my book, but, you know, buy books, support journalists, support artists. This is the time to, you know, support them any way you can. And a good way to do so is by supporting their work. And then also, you know, in writing this book, I mean, even though this is a very, at times, difficult subject, I hope that what I did was make it a very compelling read, a very readable story, like a almost kind of true crime page turner. And so the two things that I would say about the Demjanjuk case as an overall impression is, one, is that Demjanjuk gave evil a human face. That if we think of Eichmann as the master planner, then here is the person who was an enthusiastic cog in the factory of death. And then the more important point, I think, about this whole saga is that the prosecutors and judges and journalists who covered this case, who wrote about this case, did to the survivors what they were owed, which is to pursue justice, no matter the government in the US, Israel, or Germany, no matter the political party or persuasion. I think the important message here is that crimes were committed and that the guilty would be pursued until the end of their days. And that if they thought by committing the murders at Treblinka and Sobibor that no one would know what they did, no one would remember, and worse, perhaps that no one would care, this is a resounding response to that. And I think that's the important lesson to take away from this case.
Thank you, Tom. I'm going to wish you and everybody a sei gesund and invite Jill to close out our conversation.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Tom, on behalf of the museum and the audience for sharing your insights with us. You've given us all a lot to think about on a truly fascinating subject. If this were an in-person event, we would have Tom's book for sale, and we do plan to have it in our bookstore when the museum reopens. But for now, if you'd like to buy his book, which I recommend you do, we'll have to send you to an online bookseller, and I've put the Amazon link up for his book. but I know a lot of local bookstores are also selling books online because they cannot be open in person. So I encourage you to help out one of your local bookstores who really need the business now. Before we sign off, I want to let everyone know that while the museum is closed, the staff is all working hard to provide compelling virtual programs like this one. This Sunday, April 5th at 3 o'clock, we'll be hosting a talk by Holocaust survivor Erica Fabian. And on Tuesday, April 7th at 11 a.m., we'll present a talk on genealogy research techniques for Holocaust survivors and their families. So please follow this Facebook page and visit our website, lamoth.org, for the most up-to-date information about our programs. And with that, I will thank you again, Tom and Jonathan and everyone who joined us. We hope everyone stays safe and healthy. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.